Welcome to Canterbury Cast, the podcast where you'll find sermons, conversations, and all things Canterbury UMC. We're glad you're here.
So I'm a little foggy this morning. I'll go ahead and be honest and confess. I got off a plane last night about 11:15 from Costa Rica and then Dallas and then here. I was with Rachel visiting a wonderful ministry called Voice of Freedom that does some restorative prison work in Costa Rica. And you'll hear more opportunities in the near future about how you can get involved in the wonderful work that they do. But then I went to Dallas to be part of a learning cohort that I'm part of. And the weather that has been swirling around the southeast delayed all of the flights. And so luckily, I moved my flight forward only to get here at the time it was originally supposed to get here. And then I got my bags and I walked to the parking deck and went to the first floor. I think it was B, and didn't see my car. So I walked to C, and then D, and then E, and then F. Y'all familiar with the Birmingham airport and the parking garage? You know, it just makes one big semicircle, no car. It's like, wow, man, go up to the second floor. F, E, D, C, B, A, no car. Walk up to, at this point, I'm like, did I get towed? Like, where is my car? Walk up to the third floor. Back, A, B, C, D, E, F. Fourth floor. I spent 40 minutes, y'all, looking for my car. So I finally get home at midnight after looking for my car for 40 minutes. And you know, there are two types of people and they marry each other. The first type is the one who gets to the airport like 2 hours early and they use the bathroom and they get their coffee and they sit down at the gate and they're ready. And then there's me. And I like to time my arrival to the airport right in time to get on the plane. You know, if I didn't have time to use the bathroom, oh well, we'll hold it to the next destination. There's also two types of people. There's the type of person who, when they park at an airport, takes a picture of where they parked. And then there's me, who never does. And I'm just like, I'll remember where I parked. Do you know, in all the years that I've been traveling, I have never once remembered where I parked. And yet, I behave in a way that just miraculously, maybe this time, just maybe, I'll remember where I parked. We all have visions of ourselves in one way or another. Some of those visions are accurate. Some of those visions are not accurate. Despite all of the evidence, I like to see myself as someone who has a good memory, who does not have late diagnosed adult ADHD, and who is highly organized. That is not me. No matter how much I like to believe that about myself, no matter how much I would like to see that in myself, that is not who I am or how I am in the world. Now, your issue might not be organization and remembering where you parked and getting to the airport on time. Yours might be something completely different, but we all have ways in our lives that we like to envision ourselves. That we like to envision the world, that we like to envision our lives, that we like to envision ourselves. And some of those visions are true. And some of those visions might not be true. We have a story this morning of Jesus returning sight to a blind man. And it's a weird story. It only happens in Mark's gospel. You remember Mark's gospel was the first gospel that was written. It happens very fast because it's as if Mark is just trying to write down everything Jesus did as quickly as he can. And so this story happens in the very middle of Mark's gospel. And we're going to read it and we're going to talk a little bit about why it is where it is and what Mark is trying to do with the way he tells this story. So Jesus and his disciples come to Bethsaida. Some people brought a blind man to Jesus and begged him to touch and heal him. Taking the blind man's hand, Jesus led him out of the village. After spitting on his eyes and laying his hands on the man, he asked, "Do you see anything?" The man looked up and said, "I see people, They look like trees, only they're walking around. Then Jesus placed his hands on the man's eyes again. He looked up with his eyes wide open. His sight was restored, and he could see everything clearly. Then Jesus sent him home, saying, "Don't go into the village." Jesus and his disciples went into the villages near Caesarea Philippi. On the way, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" They told him, "Some say John the Baptist, others Elijah, and still others one of the prophets." And he asked them, "And what about you? Who do you say that I am?" And Peter answered, "You are the Christ." This story in Mark's gospel is intended to tell us something. And it's not just that Jesus gives sight to the blind, and it's not that, Jesus this one time didn't quite get the miracle right. Jesus puts his hands on the man's eyes, and all of a sudden he says, "I can see, but there's people, and it looks like they're trees walking around." And so Jesus tries again. Mark is bridging his gospel. For the first part of Mark's gospel, Mark spends time telling us who Jesus is through the things that Jesus does. Jesus is, there's no birth narrative in Mark. Jesus just appears. And John the Baptist has been preaching and talking about the one who is to come, that he's not worthy to untie the thong of his sandals. Jesus appears, and Mark tells us the heavens split open. Uses the word schism, splits open. And the voice of God descended on Jesus like a dove, saying, "This is my son. Listen to him." From there, Jesus immediately goes to be tempted, and he begins preaching and teaching and healing and calling his disciples. This is not the first time Jesus has visited Bethsaida. He visited it before, and he healed a blind man before, and now he's back. The disciples are a little confused along their journey with Jesus about who Jesus is. Jesus begins to tell them what it means to live a life with him. One of the themes in Mark's gospel is taking up your cross and following Jesus. There's just one problem. The disciples don't understand what that means, because the cross, according to their understanding, is a mode of capital punishment. And so the person that they believe that they are following, who would save them, there's no way that those two things can go together. And so Jesus has this strange message about taking up their own cross, just like he's going to have to take up their cross, about dying instead of living, about turning your life over for other people. And what he is doing is painting a picture, painting a vision for what it means to follow them. There's just him. There's just one problem. They can't seem to get the vision. You see, the vision Jesus paints is kind of odd. And you all know that. You're here at church. You hear people and preachers like me talk about the upside down nature of Jesus's kingdom. But the disciples miss something. What they miss is that Jesus is inviting them, in fact, urging them to take a deep look at themselves. Because until we take a deep look at who we are and how we are in the world, we'll never begin to be able to see who Jesus is and how Jesus is clearly. When we have false visions of who we are and how we are in the world, someone who is perpetually on time instead of perpetually late, who remembers where she parks instead of always forgets, you do the same things over and over again. If we were to extrapolate that into a little more spiritual language, it would be, some of us like to pretend that we are good disciples of Christ, right? Just like the disciples. But when we look at our lives, we might see that we don't actually do the things that might define a disciple of Christ. Jesus can't come in and work in us and through us and transform us if we first can't see ourselves as we are, so then we might be able to see ourselves as Jesus sees us. That's what happens with this man. It's not that Jesus messes up the miracle. It's not that Jesus doesn't get the magic words right or doesn't have the right mix of spit and dirt to put on his eyes. It's that the vision that the blind man has of what it means to have a life that has been infiltrated and healed and touched by Jesus is different than the life Jesus actually has for him. Often, we like to talk about ourselves and the world and the way things are in ways that simply just aren't true. In a nutshell, they're a myth. And why do we talk about it that way? Because it makes us feel good. If we don't have to confront the realities of what the world is, how we are in the world, how all of that exists together, then we can just kind of bebop along life and not have to worry about it. But Jesus invited the disciples, the blind man, and all of us into something more true and more real and more transformative than that. We can only change or transform a world we can speak about. And we can only speak about a world that we see. What that means is we have to be honest about what it is that we see. And so we get at that by saying, what do you see when you look at the world? I'll give you a second to think about that. What do you see when you look at the world? Do you slow down enough to look at the world? Do you see a world of kindness and love and hope? Do you see a world of darkness, fear, and despair? I don't know. Maybe it's somewhere in between. Maybe it varies on the day. But Jesus, in this passage, is inviting the disciples, is inviting the man to slow down, to take the image of God in, and to see. Nadia Bolz-Weber is a Lutheran pastor who started a church in Denver for homeless people and drug addicts and all the unsavory type that you typically would not see in church on a Sunday. And her ministry is incredible. And she sends out a newsletter every week. And I subscribed to it, and it came in my email yesterday. And Nadia talks about how it is easy in her world to see things poorly, just to see things as overrun with violence and greed and addiction and. And in her newsletter, it didn't say anything other than this. Yesterday, Eric, that's her husband, and I were driving past the park by our house. And two people stood there holding each other. Not a hug, but an extended embrace. The kind someone gives you when the unspeakable escapes and trembles from your lips. She died. He asked for a divorce. The cancer is back. You know, the kind of words that are heavy and that create a world of their own. And she said, these two people were in and out of my visual field in a moment. But I haven't stopped being able to see their image in my mind. There are moments in our lives that call for an embrace that can hold our heaving sobs, that invites them to start and allows them to do their work inside the body, that says, I'm here in such an embodied way that it can't be dismissed. How gorgeous is it that our broken heart can be partly mended by being pressed up against the heart of another? That someone could drive by and have their own heart softened at the sight of it. When you see, what do you see when you look at the world? Do you slow down enough to see the resurrected Jesus in the small moments that are so easy to overlook? A simple embrace of two strangers that transformed her day from darkness into hope. She ends her newsletter by saying, turns out there is a glimmer of light in human beings. What do you see when you look at your life? What do you see when you look at your life? That is ultimately what Jesus is inviting the disciples that he spends 3 years to engage with. What do you see? No, that's a little prickly and itchy, and you're saying, hey, don't prod. I come here to hear Natalie sing, not for you to ask me hard questions. But we can't change what we can't speak about, and we can't speak about what we don't see. And so Jesus wants to come into that, shed scales from your eyes, and allow you to see your life as a vehicle for transformation for your family, for yourself, for your community. This one's hard. What do you see when you look in the mirror? Do we fool ourselves about the kind of person we are? I've noticed that it's hard for us to be honest. Have y'all noticed that? About who we are, about how we are. There's so much guilt and shame and expectation that permeates our world and our society and our culture that to even begin to kind of tip our toe into honesty about the way we see ourselves, the way we see our world, the way we see our role in the world, feels uncomfortable. Jesus cannot begin to do Jesus' good work in us until we're honest about the world that we see. Until we're honest about the person that we see in the mirror. Now, there's a flip side of this. Some of us like to overinflate what we see in the mirror. Some of us are really hard on the person we see in the mirror. If they just knew all the things I did, they would never love me. If you knew the things my parents said to me and about me growing up, you would know why I hate myself. If you knew X, Y, or Z, or fill in the blank. And so both things are true. We can overinflate, we can underinflate what we see in the mirror, and both are hard. But until we're honest about both of those things, Jesus can't begin to allow us to see ourselves the way that God sees us, which is a beloved child of God, called to live life after Jesus. In the New York Times Magazine this week, there is an article about a Jewish woman who is a writer. And she spent her whole life, she says, trying to pretend that her family was not affected and not direct survivors of the Holocaust. This woman grew up in Jewish schools. Her grandmother was directly affected by the Holocaust. She grew up with a Jewish community. Her best friend was Jewish. When she became a writer, her best friend's dad began to ask her to write about his story. He was 7 years old in Budapest when Nazis invaded. And while he did not himself go to a concentration camp, he spent the majority of his childhood during the war in hiding to prevent from going to a concentration camp. And she said, no, she didn't want to write about that. And the way that she tells it, she was trying to leave that part of her story behind. She goes on to say that the Holocaust has touched every single Jewish person. She would ask her grandmother when she was smaller what it was like. And all her grandmother would say was, oh, that was just a big war, vaguely, and not talk about it. Her family didn't talk about being Holocaust survivors. And so when her friend's dad, who wanted her to write his story, finally got sick, she began to actually entertain the idea. She called her mom, and she said, did you ever think that our family might also be a survivor family of the Holocaust? And her mom said, well, of course. You're named after your aunt who died in a concentration camp, and I'm named after my mother's mother who died in a concentration camp. And she said, so part of her not understanding was her refusal to define herself in those terms. She was trying to separate herself, run away from her connection to her story, to her family's survival story, to that terrible past that she literally embodied with her name. And she writes that running away from our stories, running away from our realities, running away from the things that we would rather not see in ourselves, in our world, in our lives, it is one way to go about things. Or you can, like her, finally write about it. And so she wrote the Holocaust story she said she would never write. And suddenly she began to feel a little lighter, understand herself a little bit more, become more compassionate toward herself, toward other people. It's really easy with stories like this to get caught up in the miracles, especially if you're I'm looking over here at one of my NICU nurses. If you're a doctor, nurse, science person, you can get real into the stuff that makes eyes work and how and why that man might have been blind and why Jesus chose to heal that man. That's fine. But it's still just a distraction from the invitation to really see ourselves, to really see the world, so that God might transform our own eyesight so that we can get to the business of following God.
Thanks for listening. To learn more about what's going on at Canterbury, follow us on social media or visit our website at canterburyumc.org.